Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Soft Cover of ThePrint. It's an online book launch property of ThePrint that we've started recently. Obviously, given the fact that the COVID pandemic doesn't allow us to meet in person anymore. This is in collaboration with Harper Collins. The book that we're going to be discussing today is For a Moment of Taste. This is a book by Poorva Joshipura, the author, who I have with me, and we're going to talk in some detail about, what it really means to be eating an animal. We often use euphemisms. We don't call the mutton we're eating sheep or the mutton we're eating goat. We always have euphemisms. But what does it really mean for the animal? Is it okay to call an animal an individual, a person in its own right? Poorva, I'm extremely excited to talk to you about this. So tell me, to begin with, what sort of compelled you to write this book? I know you've been associated with India for a long time. You're currently the vice president of the international operations, and you've also been associated with the Animal Welfare Board of India, which is a statutory body that advises the government on animal welfare. But what has prompted you to write this book now?
Well, I wanted to have a resource, a kind of one-stop place where people can learn what happens to animals from birth to death for what is, after all, a moment of taste. When we eat something, that taste lingers on our tongues for how long? Just a few seconds, really. And for those few seconds, sheep, cows, buffaloes, chickens, fish, they often suffer an entire lifetime of suffering. The exception to that would be fish that are caught in the wild, but that also comes with tremendous suffering, where they're pulled out of the water, they suffocate to death, or they're even smashed or cut open while they're still conscious. So I wanted people to understand what really goes into those few seconds of taste on their tongue so that they can do a proper cost-benefit analysis to come to their own conclusions about whether it's worth it. And I think that most kind people simply don't know. They simply don't know exactly what happens to animals throughout their shortened lives for that moment. And so that's why I wanted to really write this book. PETA India puts out lots of videos about this. Anybody can log on to PETAindia.com and watch those videos. But to watch a 5-minute or even 10-minute video versus to read an entire book where you have the actual details of the matter is a different thing. And that's why I thought there wasn't a resource like this for the Indian audience. And I wanted to bring out especially what happens to animals in India for food.
Right. Poorva, in my experience, it's not just that people don't know, but often people get extremely resistant to even want to know about animal suffering. So how do you sort of enable people to at least begin having that conversation? Because people tend to get extremely defensive about when it comes to what is on their plate. It's almost seen as a fundamental right of human beings to be able to eat what they want. So how do you deal with that kind of a reaction from people?
Well, the question of rights is really a funny thing, because I think that rights is when nobody's getting hurt in the matter. We don't have a right to beat children just because we want to. We don't have a right to oppress women because we want to. And similarly, we don't really have a right to abuse animals simply because for a product we don't actually need. We don't need meat, eggs, or dairy to survive. In fact, if we get rid of them from our diet, we actually thrive. And I have an entire chapter in the book dedicated to what doctors and nutritionists are now saying about the health benefits of eating plants. And so this business of personal choice, it's a funny argument, because you can't really talk about personal choice when there's no choice being given to some of those involved. There's no choice being given to the animals. And if we were going to talk about what they would want to choose, they would want to choose to live. And you're right. I mean, there is oftentimes an initial hesitation. But what I say to people is, if it's so hard for you to even consider for a moment what these animals suffer, imagine what it is like for them to actually endure it. And I think a lot of that hesitation actually comes from kindness. You know, people don't want to hear something which is horrific, but the fact of the matter is, if we close our eyes and ears to it, we are actually in support of the cruelty that happens. Yeah. You know, just because we, put blinders on, it doesn't go away. And so we certainly owe it to the animals who we use by the tens of billions. You know, every year we kill worldwide over 77 billion land animals alone for meat. When you bring fish into the equation, it goes up to trillions. We owe it to those animals to understand exactly what goes on before they end up as meat on your plate.
Right. One of the most interesting arguments that I came across in your book was, and it's something that you mentioned again, about drawing this kind of parallel between oppression of certain kinds of communities or sections of the human population and oppressing animals. Often you said that the kind of logics we used to oppress, say, women or people of a certain race or a caste are very similar to the logic we use to oppress animals. Can you talk a bit more about this?
Yes, well, that comes from my own personal experiences. You know, I grew up in the U.S., as you can tell from my accent. I grew up in an area where people had never seen another Indian person. They had never seen somebody who wasn't either white or black. And so throughout my entire schooling, I faced a great deal of racism, a great deal of bullying, simply because I was different. I looked different. But of course, I had the same feelings as them. And similarly, that helped me see that when it comes to animals, we focus a lot on their differences for the purpose of oppression or for the purpose of using them. Whereas really what we should be focusing on are similarities. They are made of blood, flesh, and bone, just like us. They want to live just like us. They feel happiness, joy, jealousy, sadness, a whole range of deep emotions, just like us. And so, yes, there are exactly the same, I found that exactly the same types of justifications which are used to be homophobic or to be sexist or to be racist are very similar and comparable to the kinds of justifications we use to oppress animals. You know, we might say animals are stupid, or men might say women are stupid. Yeah. Or we might say that this person cannot feel as much as I can. This is actually a justification that was historically used by white people to oppress Black people, that they cannot feel as much as white people. Of course, we know that's ridiculous. Yeah. And so it's the same kinds of justifications that we now use for animals. And that's why the first chapter of the book is all about helping people learn what animals are like. Who are these animals who end up on our plates? Yeah. And it's all about their how they're good mothers. No, exactly.
I wanted to talk to you about motherhood in specific, because you described the journey of mothers, cows, in some detail, and motherhood for human beings is exalted as such a virtue, and when it comes to animals, that same motherhood is not sort of it basically means nothing. So talk about perhaps the journey of a cow who has to part with her calf, for the purpose of somebody's moment of taste?
Well, I think, a lot of people don't know that a mother cow or a mother buffalo has to part with her calf for the dairy that we steal from them. And we really do steal it from them, because all mammals make milk for their own species.
Okay.
Humans make it for humans, cats make it for kittens, dogs make it for puppies, cows make it for calves.
Yeah.
And because we want to steal the calves' milk for ourselves, what happens at dairies across India and around the world is that male calves are considered worthless by the dairy industry.
Yeah.
They're considered worthless because they can't produce milk. And so in India, they're often either left to starve, abandoned on the street, or sent to be killed for beef.
Yeah.
A mother buffalo or a mother cow will go to great lengths to protect her baby if she can. They form incredible bonds with their baby. In the wild, you'll see that buffaloes will fight ferociously with lions or others to try to protect their babies from harm. But what happens on dairy farms is that there is a separation that happens. The males are taken away. The females are also taken away after a short amount of time.
Okay.
And this is all so that humans can steal the milk that was actually meant for these babies. And that causes incredible grief to these mother cows and buffaloes. If you go to a dairy farm, you'll often hear incredible bellowing. And that is, it's the babies calling for their mothers, and it's the mothers calling for their babies after they've been separated. It's absolutely heartbreaking to hear that.
Right. Also, a lot of times any kind of argument on animal welfare gets lost becomes a communal conversation. In my experience, for example, if anyone is talking against Jallikattu and, being associated with PETA, you would know about this whole argument that happened, the whole controversy. It becomes about the cultural rights of human beings. If you're talking about Bakari, that becomes about the cultural rights of a minority community, of the Muslim community in India. So how does one actually manage to talk about animal welfare in such a polarized conversation that refuses to sort of acknowledge animals in the whole conversation? And given the fact that those are the ones who have to lay their lives in this conversation.
Yes, well, culture moves on. Culture need not be a static thing. There are many things that we used to do culturally that were harmful to women.
Correct.
Sati was part of our culture, for example. Dowry is part of our culture for some of us. But we've moved on from that. We don't need to remain in a particular place. And it's interesting to me that oftentimes people who are talking about, wanting to have Jallikattu, which is, for those who don't know, it's where a gang of men get together and bully a bull, often to injury or to death. They talk about this
a matter of Tamil pride or, the pride of a community. And it's odd how the pride of a community would hinge on abusing an animal.
Well, in Jallikattu, one of the prizes that used to be given away was a woman to the winner as a bride. We recognize that is wrong. Now it's time to recognize that bullying animals is also wrong. We can always modify cultures and traditions. We don't have to sacrifice goats. Instead, we can perhaps distribute vegan food, to the poor, to the hungry, to those in need. Perhaps we distribute money or clothing. Similarly, with Jallikattu, we can modify it so that animals are no longer in the equation, and it's a harvest festival. Because that's essentially essentially what it is. We can celebrate the same occasion in a different way. Just like we no longer give away women to the winners of Jallikattu. And so that's the thing, you know, the conversation has to move on as we learn more and more about animals and how they suffer for these events. We cannot continue to tolerate it. And really, India's culture is one of kindness. India's cultural and religious reverence for animals is famous around the world. You know, it has influenced people around the world to go vegetarian or to go vegan because they look to India and see, oh, wow, that's actually a way we can eat. That's actually something that's possible. We have compassion for animals as a mandate in the Indian Constitution. So it can be very easily argued that cruelty to animals is not our culture at all, and that it has been sort of seized by some as a way of, by calling it culture, calling it tradition, just as a way of justifying something that they want to continue for their own vested interests. It costs lakhs and lakhs to put on a Jallikattu event. It is a business deal. And so I think that fact sometimes gets lost. It is people making money off of abuse of animals.
Yeah. Also, you know, this is something that I personally have a lot of difficulty reconciling. So I would like to ask you, as I mentioned before, you know, the times can be so polarizing that it becomes difficult to talk about the customs and traditions of any community, and particularly the Muslim community in India today, in a way that would allow for some introspection. So as someone who does not want to target the Muslim community in any way, given the atmosphere in India, I find it hard perhaps to, you know, nevertheless talk about the problems with sacrificing a goat. So how do you think one should do that, given how prevalent Islamophobia is also?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's Muslim vegetarians and vegans all over the world, and they celebrate Eid in a different way. No religion requires meat eating. No religion requires cruelty to animals, but all religions do call for kindness to animals. And I think that is something that we need to remind people of. Whatever religion it is, religions of all kinds are used to justify cruelty to animals. And we have to remind people that that's not what religion is about in the first place. And I think that the best way to approach this is simply by being welcoming of people of all religions. You know, PETA India has members and supporters of all religions, because animal rights is for everybody, not to demonize and to simply present the facts. You know, goats are playful, goats are intelligent. Children who have to raise their goats, or at least have the goats in the house in the lead up to Eid, they get very, very attached to their goats. They don't want the goats to be killed. And they're instead told that, no, this is the way that we have to do it. But that's not the way. You don't have to do that. You don't have to harden children with violence. We can take another step forward. And we always put out examples of Muslim vegetarians and vegans and so on who are celebrating these festivals in other ways, so that people can take inspiration from that.
Poorva, very often, perhaps more often than not wrongly, veganism is presented as a very elitist concept. It's sold, it's in popular conception, it's something that is unaffordable for most people. As someone who constantly tries to shift to a vegan-based diet, I can tell you that it does take a toll on your budget as well, because more often than not, that stuff is more expensive. So how do you reconcile that? And is it correct to believe that being a vegan has to be a more expensive lifestyle that not many people can afford?
No, well, there's a huge number of vegetarians in India already. Not all of them are well off. And, about, depending on what statistic you look at, on average, you would say there's about 30% of the Indian population is vegetarian. And being vegan is simply being vegetarian, but without the dairy and without the eggs. And so it's not really different. It's not very different from being vegetarian. And you don't actually need substitutes for something which is bad. Milk is not good for the human body. It's great for a calf because it's made for a calf. But doctors now tell us that milk consumption is linked to certain cancers in humans like breast and prostate, diabetes, heart disease, and so on. So we don't need to replace something which is not good for us in the first place with something else. We can if we want to. You have soya milks and almond milks and oat milks and so on. And a cheap way of getting those is by making them yourself. There's lots of recipes for non-dairy milks on a website called Sharan, which is a vegan advocacy group. They have many recipes on their site, but you don't really need it. It's something that people have for taste. Instead of milk, they say soy milk, put soy milk in their coffee or something like that. Yeah. But you don't need to. And most people actually find that when they go vegan or when they go vegetarian, it's much, much lighter on their pockets than when they were meat eaters.
Right. So how would a non-animal based diet impact world hunger?
So the way that plant-based diets help improve the situation with regards to world hunger is that right now, much of the grain and the food that is grown goes to animals rather than to humans directly. And so you have a situation where, because if you think about, let's say, for example, a sheep, or if you think about even a chicken or a cow, you have to feed that animal a huge amount of food, give that animal a huge amount of water for what in the end is a small amount of food, a small amount of meat. Yeah. And instead, if those grains, if that corn, the soya and so on that is right now used to feed those animals were fed to humans directly, we would be much more in a better position to tackle world hunger. Right now, we are feeding animals the food that we could be instead feeding humans directly. And that's how it affects meat, dairy, and egg production affects world hunger in a very, very negative way.
Right. If there was one thing, Poorva, that the COVID-19 pandemic, having originated in the way we know it has, if there's one thing about animal welfare that it should have taught us or it should teach us, what do you think it should be?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has largely thought to have originated from a wild animal meat market in China.
Yeah.
It is not the first time that an animal disease jumped to human being at a market like that. SARS is also thought to have originated in a market like that. Numerous bird flus, including H5N1, are thought to have spread through wild animal meat markets like that. And the reason is because at these types of, not just wild animal meat markets, but at meat markets, which are also found throughout India, it is very easy for disease to spread between animal to animal and then animal to human being. H5N1 bird flu is something that plagues Indian farms every now and then, chicken farms. it has a 60% mortality rate in human beings. COVID-19, which is thought to have come through bats via an intermediary animal, perhaps pangolins, to human beings, has maybe a 3 to 4% mortality rate. We have shut down the entire world because of COVID-19. Imagine what would happen if H5N1 bird flu spread as quickly and as easily as COVID-19 does. And we're very, very close to that happening. Because all it takes right now, H5N1 bird flu, it can pretty much manage chicken to human transmission and that kind of thing. It just takes a mutation for it to evolve to be able to spread between human to human better. And not just live animal meat markets, but factory farms also provide the perfect opportunity for diseases to breed, to create diseases, and for those to then spread. H1N1 swine flu, the swine flu which circulated in 2009, it killed over 575,000 people in the first year that it circulated alone. It is thought to have its roots in North American pig farms. You know, at these farms, you have thousands of pigs all crammed together. They're bred to be homogeneous. They're bred to be very similar to each other, so disease can spread easily like wildfire between them. And because they're fed, not just pigs, but all factory farmed animals fed antibiotics, you end up with a dual situation where the animals as well as the humans become more resistant to antibiotics that we need.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, you are creating a situation where even more aggressive diseases are being born out of such farms. So COVID-19 really is a wake-up call, but it's not the first one we had. You know, SARS, bird flu, swine flu, even HIV and Ebola came from the use of animals for food. Both HIV and Ebola are thought to be linked to the wild animal meat, use of wild animals for meat. And so if we don't learn from this now, we can expect, quite sadly, possibly even another worse problem to arise out of these types of facilities.
Right. Since you talked about animal markets, I want to talk a little bit about, again, this, while for me and you, it might be obvious the kind of cruelty an animal market and means for an animal, but for a lot of people, it becomes the question of the livelihood of the communities involved in either slaughter of animals or in animal trade, animal markets. For a lot of people, that is their source of livelihood. So how do you reconcile that? And how do you, that's something I believe that happened in Uttar Pradesh when they decided to close down slaughterhouses all of a sudden. We suddenly had a lot of people unemployed. So how does one grapple with that question? Because you can't suddenly ask people who've been engaged in a certain kind of trade, which is very obviously cruel to me, but how do you ask them to suddenly give that up?
Yeah, well, the people who work in these factory farms and slaughterhouses and so on, they're often victims of this trade themselves. You know, they're the ones who get the zoonotic diseases from animals first. They're the ones working often in dangerous conditions with no relief. You know, if they get sick or if they get injured, that's usually it for them. But as the world, you know, it's all about supply and demand. You know, as the world changes, and you see this, for example, in the United States and elsewhere, where more and more people are having vegan foods or non-dairy milks and so on, you're seeing a transition where once a dairy farm was using cows, now they're making milk using nuts. We have one dairy, for example, in the United States that's made that transition. We have examples of farmers that have switched from beef production. There's one fellow that I talk about in the book in England. He went from beef production to being a plant farmer. And you have these kinds of examples in this kind of transition. Yeah. And as more and more people are interested in things like faux meats, non-dairy milks, dairy-free cheeses, and so on, these are new business opportunities that farmers can be transitioned to, or that they may decide to take on themselves once they recognize the business opportunity, because we're seeing that happen in the West already. And as more and more people learn about the health benefits of eating plant-based, how they can help animals and also how they can help the planet, because meat, egg, and dairy production is incredibly resource intensive. It uses way more land, water, and so on than a plant-based diet. As more and more people are learning about this, more and more people are making the switch, but that is also providing completely new opportunities.
The first chapter of your book, I'd like to go back to that as we conclude this session. It's called The Individual on My Plate. And of course, in other parts of the world, this movement for personhood for animals is sort of gaining steam. But, considering in India and even in other parts of the world, we are still talking about ensuring that hens are not cramped up in battery cages. And, the penalty for throwing a dog from the roof or from the terrace is more than 50 rupees. Do you think that conversation, that goal is achievable at all? Or are we very, very far from that?
Well, I think it's certainly an important conversation to have, because what the entire personhood for animals movement is about, it's not that we're trying to say that animals should have exactly the rights as human beings, because some rights are meaningless. They don't need a right to vote because they can't vote. But what it is about is recognizing that, like humans, they are intelligent, they have the capacity to feel pain, and that just as we respect the rights of other humans off the back of those reasons, we also should be respecting animals. And some courts around the world, including in India, have recognized the personhood status of some species of animals. And it is a dialogue that we need to keep happening even as animals continue to be used. Because I think that the more and more we recognize that animals have feelings, that they're intelligent, that they don't want to die, that they don't want to suffer, that they don't want to spend their entire existence in a zoo locked behind bars or in a laboratory setting. It's not just animals used for food, or in a marine park where an orca is made to do tricks, or any of those things. If we recognize that it is wrong to do those things to a human person, we can start, as we learn more and more about animals, recognizing that it's wrong to do to animal persons as well. And so, yes, I agree with you that we have huge numbers of cruelty to animals that we need to address, but I don't think we can wait until those things come to an end before we start having this conversation. I think that talking about the needs of animals, the intelligence of animals, the emotional capacities of animals, helps us come closer to a time when we will look back at what we used to do to animals as a matter of shame. The same way we look back at things like slavery, and recognize that as a dark part of our history.
Yeah. Poorva, thank you so much for talking to us about this book. I think the viewers or people who've watched us would be able to some degree, understand that there is really no tension between human rights and animal rights, as so long as we're ready to see them in a holistic way and see the person of animals in a holistic way. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would highly recommend everyone who has any kind of curiosity about what it means to actually have an animal on their plate, who sometimes has had a moment of guilt when while eating the mutton they so love, to pick up this book, and it'll free you of a lot of guilt, and it'll actually compel you to take an action and give up that meat. Thank you so much for talking to us, Poorva.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.